Welcome to the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance 10-7 and the One Revolution, Stand Against Hate Communities. I am Jeffrey Geisner, founder, and thanks for joining us for another 2024 on-demand summer program series. Today's program is entitled Terezin Diaries, Not the Last Butterfly. I didn't realize how emotional this program would be for me to curate and produce. A short backstory. I wanted to share some family pictures. First is my grandmother and grandfather Katie and Alfred Giesener. My father, Rolf Giesener, at 14, just before he left Berlin, Germany, on the last Kindertransport from Berlin in 1935, and my dad at age 28 in Palestine and before war broke out in 1948, where he served in the Haganah Air Force. Dad sure was a handsome man, and it looks like he attracted the ladies. This was before he met Mom after the War of Independence in 1948 on the Golden Beach in Tel Aviv, Israel. They were married in Tel Aviv in 1950. My grandfather, Alfred Giesener, a World War decorated war veteran from Berlin, Germany, saved my dad, a boy only 15 years old, by marching him to the front of the line on the very last Kindertransport sponsored by Hadassah in 1935, just a couple of months after the Nuremberg laws were implemented in Germany. Dad and 100 other teenagers went by train to Italy and then boarded the ship Galilea to Port Haifa, Palestine. He arrived there in early 1936. My grandfather was 59 years old, stripped of his dignity by the Nazis, penniless, without adequate housing, money, or his health. My grandfather was then deported to Terezin in November 1942, and he was murdered there in May 1943. It is still a mystery to me how he was able to survive being severely ill for such a long time. A word of caution. The scenes, music, photos, and video clips in the film may be disturbing to some, especially those like me who suffer from intergenerational survivor trauma. However, I am also very cautious curating these films, and nothing shown is something you haven't seen many times before. I hope you find Terezin Diaries, Not the Last Butterfly, interesting and informative. Please share it with your friends and family, and help us by subscribing to the JCHR 10-7 YouTube channel, so you'll be notified when a new program is released.
Through the snow, the legions of occupation march into Czechoslovakia. This rapid stroke, which has outraged all freedom-loving nations of the world, is carried out with military exactitude. Artillery rolls into Prague and mounts guard on the Hradčin, the castle of King Wenceslas. Infantry, too, stride confidently through the streets of the city, now reduced to the capital of a protectorate. Here and there, citizens of German origin give the conquerors a welcome, but Czechs either watch sullenly or stay away. Presently, from a window of the castle, you may catch a glimpse of Hitler himself contemplating his new conquest. Though the great powers remain at peace, this new shock, following hard upon a period of apparent improvement in international relations, appalled the world. Witness the questions addressed to Hitler by Mr. Chamberlain in his speech at Birmingham.
How did the Nazis manage to kill 6 million Jews and keep so much of the world in the dark? Part of the answer is in our story tonight. It concerns a concentration camp called Theresienstadt. It was in Czechoslovakia, and near the end of the war, the Nazis used it to con the world. Reports had begun circulating in Allied capitals that the Nazis were exterminating Jews. The Nazis wanted to refute those reports, so they took this one camp, Theresienstadt, and turned it, if ever so briefly, into a model town. They shot a movie there to prove how good they were to the Jews, and they invited the Red Cross to inspect it.
In June 1944, a delegation of Red Cross visited the Jewish ghetto in a town called Terezin, back then located in Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, nowadays in the Czech Republic, to see if Jews are being mistreated, used for manual labor, and killed. At this time, millions of Jews were already killed by Nazis in concentration camps. People heard about it, but they still did not believe it. They even called people who were spreading these messages Jewish sensationalists. So on June 23, 1944, the delegation made of 3 men, 2 from Denmark, 1 from Switzerland, arrived to Terezin. Maurice Russell, the Swiss member of the delegation, wrote, "Terezin camp is not a transit camp. Nobody who arrives here is sent somewhere else. After we entered the ghetto, we didn't see anybody malnourished. People get here the same amount of food as anywhere else in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. People even get here things which you cannot get anywhere else in the Protectorate. Who wants to eat, eats. People go eat to canteens. They are served by a young woman in an apron and a pretty cap, like in any other restaurant." The delegation visited the Jewish Administration Center, where they looked at manipulated statistics from the ghetto. They even visited the laundry room, bakery, canteen, saw a part of the opera that was playing in the local cultural center, visited the post office, bank, pharmacy, butcher shop, grocery store. All looked well to them. The whole visit took around 8 hours, and all 3 members wrote a report after. They all agreed that the ghetto looked better than they expected. But what they saw was a carefully orchestrated play planned by the Nazi propaganda. The reality of what was going on within the walls of Terezin was much different. This, nowadays a small town with about 2,000 inhabitants during the Second World War, was a place where about 155,000 Jews were sent in this town. Terezin was a fortress built in the end of the 18th century. It was constructed from 230 million bricks and was put at a strategic point on the border with Germany, back then Prussia. Holy Roman Empire had an ongoing conflict with Prussia. That's why it was important for them to have a fortress here. Terezin is named after the Empress Maria Theresa. Her son Joseph II actually established Terezin and named it after her. In the end, the fortress was never used, and over time it turned into a town with about 7,000 inhabitants. That is until the Nazis took Czechoslovakia over. In 1941, Nazis decided to use Terezin as a ghetto for Jews from Bohemia and Moravia. They ordered all original inhabitants to move out of here, and instead of them, Jews were relocated. The problem was that this town originally had around 7,000 inhabitants, and the number of Jewish people in Bohemia and Moravia at that time was around 90,000 people. And as train after train was arriving to Terezin, bringing more and more people, the ghetto was running out of space. Winter of 1942. There is about 50,000 people in the ghetto. That's about 10 times more than the original amount of inhabitants. Food is scarce. Sometimes 3 people sleep in a place of 1. Fleas and lice everywhere. Lack of vitamins and malnutrition. Death rate starts to climb. Daily, about 150 people die. Sometimes people even commit suicides, especially the elderly, who receive the lowest amount of food since they cannot work. The crematorium outside of Terezin burned more than 30,000 bodies within a couple of years. Sometimes the furnace of the crematorium burned multiple bodies at once because the amount of the dead was unmanageable. Terezin was never built as an extermination camp, but because of the awful conditions inside of here, it basically became one. And this is not the worst part yet. The worst part of Terezin was just next to the ghetto, the so-called small fortress. As you can see from this map, Terezin consists of 2 parts. This is the big fortress. This is where we are now. It is where the military barracks were located, and this is where the Red Cross came for a visit with a delegation. And then there's this part. It is called the small fortress. It was used as the Gestapo prison. This is where the Red Cross never made it. This is where they kept prisoners of war, members of resistance, and also if a Jewish person broke a law in a big fortress, they would be sent there as a punishment. So this is where we are going next. You see how the ground goes downhill over there? This is the moat. Don't forget that this place was built as a military fortress in the 18th century, In case of an attack, the floodgates would be open and the river that goes through Terezin would fill up the moat here in just a few hours. Imagine going through that as an 18th century soldier while being shot at from the fortress. After you arrived to the small fortress, you would go through sometimes hours-long registration process, where you had to stand in a line facing the wall. Then you would go through the registration rooms, where you would be stripped of your belongings, given a prison number and a cell. Women and men were divided into two different sections, and then based on their nationality, political or religious beliefs, into different cells. The cells were all identical: bunk beds, toilet, hanger for clothes, and a place for a bowl and a spoon. Every cell would fit about 30 men, but in reality, up to 100 were kept here during the worst times of the war. And if you thought that these cells were bad, wait to see what's behind this wall. This is where, for example, where members of resistance, political prisoners, prisoners of war were brought. This is where they would beat them up. And as you can see that there's this tall wall, so nobody would actually see the beating, but everybody would hear it. This is where the showers are located. They would wash off the blood from their bodies. After that, they would bring them over there to the solitary cell. A process that was repeated many times up until they could find out some information. This is where the solitary cells are located. As you can see, there is nothing inside of this room. And this is exactly how it was. No bed, no toilet, just a small window that would be locked from the opposite side. And the prisoner would be in complete darkness here, which was obviously very disorienting. So sometimes they wouldn't know how long they were actually kept in the solitary cells. There is one where the window is closed, like this one, so you can have an idea of how dark it was really there. So people would be there for days, naked, cold. And obviously there was really no way out of here, only execution or sickness sometimes. There is one very famous solitary cell in the end of this corridor. This is the solitary cell of Gavrilo Princip. You might be thinking, Valerie, Gavrilo Princip lived during the First World War. You're absolutely correct, but Terezin was used as prison for political prisoners even before that. So Gavrilo Princip was actually sent here. There was another Greek national hero, Alexander Ypsilantis. He was also imprisoned here. As you can see, these sinks are in a pretty good condition. That's because they were never actually used. They were installed here just in case the Red Cross delegation makes it to the small fortress, but they were never used by the prisoners of the camp. Now we will go through these corridors. They are definitely not meant for people with claustrophobia, and they were built here during the establishment of the Terezin fortress and meant for the soldiers that would be defending the fortress in case of an attack. So if you were a soldier back then, this is where you stand. This is where you would put your rifle, and over there would be the enemy soldier, and you would shoot them in the back. This used to be the training ground for Czechoslovakian soldiers for shooting. This was used as an execution ground during the Second World War. This is where they killed many people. You might be wondering, what is the swimming pool doing here? Well, this is the part where the Nazi soldiers lived. So this was actually a swimming pool built for them by the prisoners that use just their hands and spoons. And this is where the soldiers were having fun. They also had a casino there and a cinema. This is where the prison commander lived with his wife and their children. Right next to the execution ground, right next to the cells where people were kept in inhumane conditions. This was the reality of Terezin. Nazis planned to use this town as part of their propaganda from the beginning, and when the Red Cross announced that they will pay Terezin a visit, they had 6 months to prepare. So they put fresh plaster on the walls, changed the street names, planted flowers, and even sent people who looked malnourished to the gas chambers. In the end, they managed to fool the Red Cross, and with them, the whole world. Recent history. Maybe you heard, but Madeleine Albright, the first woman to hold the post of the Secretary of the United States, passed away recently. And not many people know, but she was actually Czech. Her name was Jana Korbelova, and her family was Jewish, and many of her family members went through Terezin Concentration Camp, and she installed this memory plaque for them here.
at Auschwitz, May 18, 1944. František Brozna, 14 years old, perished at Auschwitz, December 15, 1943. Eva Balova, 15 years old, perished at Auschwitz, October 4, 1944. Liana Franklova, 13 years old, perished at Auschwitz, October 19, 1944. Alfred Weissmann, 16 years old, perished at Auschwitz, December 18, 1944. Honza Kosek, 16 years old, perished at Auschwitz, January 21st, 1945.
You're very smart.
Thank you.
Helga Weissova was the daughter of a prosperous banker until her family and all of Prague's Jews were forced to give up their homes and wealth and herded onto trains to live in a ghetto. Helga, what do you remember of this journey 77 years ago?
I remember everything. There are things I cannot forget. But I remember how we traveled at the time, but it was not such a nice day. It was cold, snow. It was December 1941.
Yeah.
I was 12. They were SS men, and they were screaming on us and they gave us orders how to do, and all the time, hurry, hurry along.
Helga and I are taking the same journey she and her family took in 1941 to a garrison town called Terezin. When you started your journey, what did you think it would be like at the other end?
We were perhaps a little naive. They thought us we will be somewhere concentrated in a ghetto. We didn't expect the war would be so long, and so we suppose somehow we would survive it.
What were you allowed to take with you to bring?
It was very few things. we were allowed to take 50 kilo luggage. 50 kilo luggage is not too much. I was very fond of drawing since my childhood, so I put inside my luggage a box of watercolors, some crayons and some paper.
We're arriving at the station where Helga disembarked. It's nearly 2 miles from the Terezin camp. Yeah, be very careful. I'm carrying your handbag. Okay? And this is the same... Is that the same station building as when you came?
I think so. From here, we had to walk to Terezin.
How far was that?
3 kilometers.
3 kilometers. And was it cold?
It was cold and it was snow.
So there was snow everywhere. You'd have been freezing.
It was in December.
Yeah. It's a long way.
Yes.
The prisoners were forbidden to keep records of their time in Terezin. But this didn't stop Helga from using the pens and papers she packed to keep a diary, which she illustrated with drawings like this one of the prisoners walking to the camp.
A bumpy road and a thaw. Our heavy feet sink into the mud and dirty yellow water squirts out from beneath the carriages laden with luggage. We learn lots of unpleasant things. The worst is that men and women live separately.
Everybody who was able to walk had to walk.
Yeah.
Some old or ill were carried.
So this is coming up to Terezin, isn't it?
So we are inside.
Terezin suited the Nazis' purpose. As a former garrison town, it was separate from other settlements, with a clear perimeter to prevent the inhabitants escaping. Before the war, 7,000 people lived here, but the Nazis threw them out, so more than 8 times that number of Jews could be crammed into the same space.
Always the memories come back. I recognize the buildings.
Is this the original door?
Yes, this was the entrance, we came inside. But only women. Women and men were separated. My father was sent somewhere else, but we didn't yet know where.
So you and your mother must have been very worried about your father, what was happening.
You know, we were, sure we were. We weren't allowed to go outside.
Helga's painting of the corridor inside the barracks gives a flavour of how grim life was. The little girl in the makeshift bed has tuberculosis.
And they invited the Red Cross to inspect it. Central to the deception was the performance of a children's opera called Brundibar. The opera survived the war, and so did a few members of its cast. They're in their mid-70s now, and a few months ago they invited us to spend some time with them. Every summer, a remarkable reunion takes place in these lush mountains in the Czech Republic. A group of friends come together from all over the world. They have one thing in common. They all grew up in the shadow of death in a concentration camp outside of Prague. They grew up quickly. Helga Kinsky couldn't speak about the horror for a full 40 years.
Because actually, whatever you did, you didn't have the right to live. You were sentenced to death. And that is something you can't get over.
Their friendship began here in Theresienstadt, a transit camp. From here, a garrison town before the war, Jews were sent off to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Nearly 140,000 Jews from all over Central Europe passed through here, including many of Europe's most prominent artists, who left a record of what it was like. Much of the art has survived, some of it by children. They portrayed how cold and crowded they were, sleeping 30 to a room. Typhus epidemics swept through the camp. The dead were brought to catacombs before being incinerated. Bodies were carried on the same wagons used for bread. Jews weren't gassed here, but more than 30,000 died of disease and hunger. Music flourished in the camp. It was like a Juilliard for Jews. There were classes and concerts in cellars and attics. The hottest ticket in town was a children's opera called Brundibar, which was written by a Czech Jew and smuggled into the camp.
It wasn't easy to get tickets.
Dita Kraus was in the choir in Brundibar. Tickets were printed for Brundibar?
Tickets were printed for every performance.
And Brundibar was a difficult ticket to get?
Yeah, most, I think. Maybe the most difficult.
It was performed 55 times by children in Theresienstadt.
Winter wind came blowing, goosey flew up high.
It's a fairy tale of sorts, the story of a young brother and sister who, with the help of a cat, a dog, a bird, and the children of the village, defeat an evil organ grinder named Brundibar. The opera ends with a victory song. Back in the camp, the Nazis filmed this performance in 1944. The lead role, the part of Brundibar, was played by a boy named Hansa Treichlinger. He's the kid with the mustache.
Everybody loved him, and everybody adored him.
Back then, Ella Weisberger played the cat.
I wore my sister's ski pants and my mother's sweater, black sweater. This was my costume.
Wearing a costume was a relief from what Ella and the other kids had to wear all the time in the camp.
This was the only time that they said we don't have to put on the Jewish star. A little couple minutes of freedom.
A couple of minutes of freedom for Ella the cat.
All I can hear and see is Ella never stopping to sing the cat. So we all sang the cat in the end.
Eva Gross was 20 at the time. She taught the children.
This was very nice, very liberating, and of course the whole, not only the whole room, the whole house, the whole town sang the victory song afterwards.
The whole town was mesmerized by the opera, the story of an evil man with a mustache. An evil man with a mustache? Did the kids have any idea what the opera was really about?
Oh yes, they knew exactly the symbolic meaning. I'm sure they did. The whole thing was, of course, symbolic, you know. Brundibar was Hitler. So, oh yes, they knew.
It was our way to fight the evil. The Germans, maybe.
Honda Drury was a member of the chorus. Once, she got a chance to play the dog. It's a story of defiance. Didn't the Germans realize that, and weren't they worried about that?
Yeah, that's what we wondered all the time. If they don't understand that what we are singing is against them, if they don't understand it, or if they just don't care because they knew what we didn't know, that we are meant all to go to the gas chambers and to die, not to survive. Maybe they thought, let the Jews play a little bit before they go to be killed.
But by 1944, reports were circulating in Allied capitals that Jews were being deported and exterminated. The Nazis wanted to refute those reports. They decided on an audacious deception to make Theresienstadt look like a model Jewish town, to invite in the International Red Cross for an inspection, and to make this propaganda film showing what a nice place it was. A beautification plan was implemented immediately. They painted buildings, they planted flowers and opened stores. They put up a bandstand in the town square. Helga Kinski watched it all unfold.
They built a kindergarten in a small park. They opened a coffee shop, and they chose the people who sit there and listen to music and drink their coffee, usually young, pretty women. They made Terezin into a beautiful little place.
And they made it a lot less crowded. Just before the Red Cross delegation arrived, the Nazis shipped 7,500 people off to Auschwitz, creating more open spaces. The stage was now set. On June 23, 1944, the Red Cross delegates came for their one-day visit and the show began. The Nazis decided that a performance of Brundibar would be the highlight. Paul Sanford was in the orchestra. He played the trumpet. What was that performance of Brundibar like?
It was a little more tense. A little more tense because we had this feeling of, I at least had the feeling, you must not fail. You must play for your life.
The Red Cross delegates went exactly where the Nazis took them. They didn't question a single prisoner. They saw no evil, they heard no evil. In fact, the Swiss head of the delegation took these pictures to show how happy the children looked.
That's me, standing there.
That was taken the day of the Red Cross visit?
Yes.
Yes.
That was a show. I knew it was a show.
The deception worked. The final report of the Red Cross delegation read that Theresienstadt looks like a normal provincial town where, and this is a quote, the elegantly dressed women all had silk stockings, scarves, and stylish handbags. The delegates also wrote that Theresienstadt is a final destination camp and that people who come here are not sent elsewhere. In fact, by the time of the visit, some 68,000 people had already been shipped from here to the death camps. And they convinced the world, didn't they?
Yes, but they only convinced the world because the world wanted to be convinced. It's easier.
When the show was over, the transports to Auschwitz were accelerated. Those who stayed behind, like Ella Weisberger, watched as their friends and fellow cast members were herded onto the trains.
I tell you the truth, when we were saying their last goodbye to Samarov, sorry, I can't say it today. I said, I will see you later. I don't want to say goodbye.
As the trains kept on heading to Auschwitz, the cast of Brundibar kept on changing. Ella's co-star, Hansa Treiklinger, that young boy who played Brundibar, was sent to the gas chambers in 1944. The opera's composer, Hans Krasse, was killed about the same time. For those who stayed here in Theresienstadt, it meant learning new parts all the time, but that wasn't a problem because everyone knew the opera by heart. But by the end of '44, performances stopped abruptly because there was hardly anyone left. Dieter Kraus was 14 when she was bundled onto a train to Auschwitz.
For me, the Holocaust started after Terezin. Terezin was still acceptable compared to what was after. The day we left Terezin, the world changed totally, radically.
Like very few other cast members of Brundibar, Dieter survived Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. But she lost most of her family and many of her friends.
So few of them survived. And they were so talented. There were so many wonderful children among them, and promising children. Children that would have become poets and artists, and so many of them. They're all gone for nothing.
The cast members of Brundibar who did survive got together this autumn. They walked around Theresienstadt, that old concentration camp, which is now a provincial town again. And Brundibar, children from all over the world perform this opera these days, this fairy tale set to music. Tonight, children from a nearby Czech school put on a performance for members of the original cast. In the same Theresienstadt attic where they first performed it more than 60 years ago. The girls, as they still call themselves, remembered their lines. The school children invited them to join in the finale, the victory song. They stole the show.
At first, music was played in secret. Instruments were forbidden, but they were smuggled in and people made use of what they found in the camp. Then, during 1942, concerts, lectures and a cultural life were permitted, positively encouraged. Jewish leaders had persuaded the Nazis of the benefits of such activities, and the so-called Freizeitgestaltung, free time administration, was established to organize a wide range of events. These were later used cynically by the Nazis for a propaganda film. But for the prisoners, they grew from a genuine need for artistic expression, an escape from their confinement. Although many composers were writing music in Terezin, there were four in particular who represent a lost generation of Czech music. Victor Ullmann was already well established. He'd worked in Vienna and Berlin. Pavel Haas was a leading disciple of Janacek, while Hans Krasser was awarded a state prize for an opera, The Uncle's Dream, and his symphony had been played by Kusevitsky and the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Gideon Klein was a young, aspiring composer and a pianist, and the principal inspiration behind musical life in Terezin was the conductor Raphael Schechter.
To, co bylo vlastní Raphaelovi Schechterovi, jeho nepředstavitelnou tvůrčí energií, v této situaci, kdy lidé neměli co jíst, a on dokázal sestavit sbor už hned na začátku prosinci roku 1941. Zpívali si po večerech, ale neměli noty. A když přijel Gideon Klein do kasáren, tak ho Schechter požádal, aby pro ten sbor zharmonizoval písně. A pak neměli ani notový papír, tak si nalinkovali noty a tam vznikla vlastně první kulturní činnost.
Já si pamatuju, že to taky tam bylo třeba kvarteto, které hrálo. A lidi, prostě, kteří to slyšeli, tak byli jako na okamžik vytrženi z těch strašných podmínek. Myslím si, že to chápu, protože jsem zažil něco podobného v daleko mírnější míře za takzvaného socialismu, že pro nás to byl způsob, jak vlastně ve zdraví duševním přečkat situaci, která se nás snažila nejen umlčet, ale nějakým způsobem zničit. Samozřejmě tam to bylo daleko teda intenzivnější tlak a tím větší osvobození právě pro lidi bylo, že se tomu nemohli věnovat.
This document, dated February 1944, lists 1 week's music in Terezin. On Sunday alone there were 3 concerts, a performance by the Tauber Orchestra, Johann Strauss's Die Fledermaus and Verdi's Requiem conducted by Raphael Schechter. But one of the most celebrated productions, also led by Schechter, was of Smetana's opera The Bartered Bride.
Víte, prodaná nevěsta se stala tenkrát symbolem osvobození, bych řekl. Oni sehnali někde ve sklepě piano, který nemělo ani nohy. Bylo postavený na židlích a mělo pedály teda a u toho Raphael Schechter řídil veliký sbor a sóla a lidé, nebo obecenstvo, viselo. To byla tělocvična, co se to dělalo, a ty lidi viseli na žebřících a ta radostná muzika se proměnila v to, že vlastně všichni plakali.
To bylo nezapomenutelné představení, protože já už jsem vám říkala, že mě bylo 12, když jsme přijeli do Terezína. Tohle už jsme asi 2 roky v Terezíně žili, ale už asi 2 roky předtím, než jsme jeli do Terezína, jsme vlastně jako Židé vůbec nikam nesměli. Nesměli jsme do divadla, nesměli jsme na koncert, nesměli jsme nikam. Vůbec první moje setkání s hudbou nebo s operou, bylo to nezapomenutelné. Protože od té doby jsem už tu operu samozřejmě viděla pak mnohokrát a viděla jsem ji v Národním divadle a viděla jsem koncertní sály, ale ten dojem to nikdy nepřekonal.
My jsme s Rafaelem Šechterem jako vrchol té celé několikaleté spolupráce dělali Verdiho Requiem. Verdiho Requiem je oříšek i pro profesionály a natož pak pro sbor z amatérů. Ten sbor to dokonale zpíval.
Terezin, contrary to public information, was not a concentration camp. Terezin was originally a town, a fortress, which was built, I don't know, 17-something, against the Prussians by Maria Theresa, and it had walls. And the Germans decided that it would be a very good place to put all the Jewish population in as a waiting room, and from there to send them to the extermination camps or whatever. We didn't know anything about it at all. So amongst all the population, especially from Czechoslovakia, were original artists, professional artists, conductors, musicians, soloists, actors, writers. So they all came in and said, now, well, you know, since we are here, shouldn't we do something? We must use the art, we must perform here. This is terribly important. And it will not be entertainment. We need to create. It's a human nature. If people are incarcerated, they want to express themselves. The Germans have nothing against it. Yes, you go ahead. We will call it friendly evenings, Freudenabende. So that was green light. People immediately started building stage and wooden benches and so on. The musicians, some of them brought their own instruments, which was allowed, started to be organized into a string quartet and later on into a full orchestra. There were young jazz musicians. So it was a sudden uplift. There were people who were composers, and they took the opportunity and wanted to create new music to express their feeling of the place and the situation and well, whatever one can express in music. And the result was that the people who came to a concert or to a play in that place suddenly felt human beings. So all that was allowed, but of course what we didn't know is what the Germans knew, that we were sentenced to death, sooner or later. My personal story is that when the time came, most of the artists, whether it was theater or music or anything else, transport to the east on the train. We had no idea where we were going. There were old people, young people, children crying, some people died. You know, you accept these situations because it happens. There is nothing else you can do. Raphael Schechter was sitting opposite me. Suddenly, he took out a tin dish, last piece of bread, which we got, ration, and he had a tin of sardines. Gives it to me and says, Denko, here is my last ration of bread. I want you to break it up into the tin, put the whole lot of sardines in it, mix it up, and took a spoon out of his shoe, which he got stuck in. Mix it all up and give it to me. It will be my last dinner, my last supper. And I thought, why is he so pessimistic? We don't know where we're going, it mightn't be so bad. Let's see after we get there what happens and so on. One has to have hope. It was his last dinner. It was his last. When we arrived in Auschwitz, of course, that was a completely different story what happened. There were dogs and guards and noise and shouting and barbed wires, and you had no idea. So where are you? What is all this? No, nobody told us it exists. And there was a selection, but so quick that nobody could understand what it was about, what did it mean. In the middle was one of them, with his left hand leisurely, without any feeling, left, 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 right, next, next. My mother immediately left leisurely, like, you know, on me I was 19 already and a sportswoman and looked strong, so I went right. On my sister, nothing. So I grabbed her and took her with me. And that was all. No idea that who went left went to immediate death in the gas chambers, and those with me right was labor, forced labor and so on, still being given a chance to live. Until the end of the war, I didn't even know where I was, what happened in Auschwitz.
I went downstairs and there was a man sitting, and she just said, I want to know, do all of you like to sing?
If people are robbed of freedom, they want to be creative, and they were.
Where this music is powerful, it represents a threat. And it was a tremendous challenge to have the Germans right there in front of us and tell them to their face,
It was something which made us strong. It has given us a resistance against our fate.
Doing a performance was not entertainment. It was a fight for life.
This Verdi's Requiem put all of us into another world. This was not the world with the Nazis. This was our world.
These were hours of pure joy, as much as you can call joy in camp.
Here they were, surrounded by man's worst, and these Jewish prisoners were determined to remind everyone of man's best. And I brought the Verdi here because I want to assure these people that we've heard them.
Point did you, did you think there would be a work come out of it?
I think that I didn't know what was going to come out of this until I started to meet people who were there. I knew I had to do something because I was consumed by it. I was very moved, deeply touched, frightened, terrified by what I was learning, and inspired by it all at once. People started asking me, "You're going to do a book about this?" I would talk to everybody about this. And I hadn't even thought of anything like that. I didn't know. And then suddenly, I just needed to get this on stage. I just had that feeling. It came to me that the live audience needed to hear the Verdi Requiem in this context. That if I had people in a concert hall, that I think that I could interweave the story and give a new meaning to the Verdi Requiem. And so I felt it had to be a live experience.
When you found out what the piece was that they played there so many times, and having conducted it yourself, I'm sure so many times, it must have made the piece take on a whole new meaning for you.
What were these Jews doing with virtually little time left of their lives? It seemed. I know they were in a state of denial about that, but they were also realistic about it at the same time. There was this yin-yang right down the center. We're going to die, we're going to live. And to have their work and energy and devotion, these are hungry people and sick people, and they came to rehearsals to learn by rote the Verdi Requiem so they could sing it for their fellow prisoners and sing it against the Nazis. And it's an unbelievable, powerful statement. And suddenly, I began to think as they did. Good heavens, when you start to think of Dies Irae, the day of judgment. Is it a day of judgment between me and God, as I'm going to be judged by my sins on earth, or is it a day of judgment, of what the Nazis will be, how the Nazis will be judged? That God is in charge of humanity, and if anybody fools around with that, they're going to hear from God. When you start to read the Mass as though you were a prisoner in Terezin, and you start to see things like liberame, which technically means deliver me, O Lord, but in this case, it's liberate me, O Lord. The whole notion and nature of liberation, I mean, it's a different sort of meaning entirely when you're a prisoner. So I started rereading the Mass about Liber Scriptus, what is written, and how you will be judged, and called before whom, and the fires of hell, meaning this. I mean, it was an overwhelming, powerful, gripping and magnetic story within the text of the traditional Mass, now reinterpreted by the prisoners of that camp. Just knowing that, before I ever conducted it again, changed. I thought to myself, well, there it is. I will never think of the Verdi the same way. And teleprompter from 2 to what? 2 to 3:30. 2 to 3:30, that's perfect.
At the end of this full day's rehearsal, Murray was raw and possessed.
How are you? Are you sleeping? Are you eating?
No, I'm not sleeping and I'm not eating. No, I'm consumed by the responsibility of a massive project. And I will tell you right now, it's not the financial responsibility. It's not the technical responsibility. And to a certain degree, it isn't even the musical responsibility. It is the moral responsibility. I'm consumed with trying to pay homage to the dignity and wonderment of those people in Terezin, and I'm constantly consumed with, are we doing the right thing? Are we doing enough? Are we saying it correctly? And then we focus on you again for about 10 seconds.
Okay. I think this is the pinnacle of his existence. I think that everything is coming to this point, that this is the most important moment in his career, and it should be. I mean, this is a major, major undertaking. Setting of the Verdi Requiem in this context is really extraordinary. It's an amazing project.
Here we go. Bar 78, please. I'll never get over this. You know, it's just, it's too mammoth. And all of this is simply 2 things. To make a hero out of Raphael Schechter, and to ask people who come in contact this, that from now on, when you hear the Verdi Requiem, think of Terezin, in addition to everything else it could mean to you. Think of those poor souls. Welcome.
But Murray's day wasn't over yet. A lecture at Lewis and Clark College.
I did just bolt upright early one morning and said, no, wait a second, there's something wrong with this picture. By this time, it's quite likely that many knew that the potential of death faced them.
He shared the podium with Edgar Krause, Schechter's cellmate.
The singing itself gave you the feeling that you're free, at least for that period of time, brings you close to your home activities, cultural activities, and I think in this way strengthened your morale and supported the hope.
The day of the premiere of Defiant Requiem had finally come. The hall was filling. The technicians in the truck were counting down the minutes. And then Murray Sidlin's masterpiece was fact.
6, 5, 8.
Is the look on Murray Sidlin's face after it was over.
I just thought, you know, please God, let Rafi approve of what I'm doing. That's all. Let it be something that he would smile on.
The very last, so richly, brightly, dazzlingly yellow. Perhaps if the sun's tears would sing against a white stone. Such a yellow is carried lightly way up high. It went away, I'm sure, because it wished to kiss the world goodbye. For 7 weeks, I've lived in here, penned up inside this ghetto. But I have found my people here. The dandelions call to me. and the white chestnut candles in the court. Only I never saw another butterfly. That butterfly was the last one. Butterflies don't live in here, in the ghetto.
Butterfly Project and Never Saw Another Butterfly. I've learned so much more about the children of Terezin and how they had kept faith through all of the Holocaust, knowing that they had death upon them.
In schools, we mostly learn about the adults in the Holocaust. By doing the Butterfly Project and I Never Saw Another Butterfly, I've learned that there were so many kids involved in the Holocaust that you couldn't even begin to imagine.
Over 1.1 million children alone died in the Holocaust.
Out of the 15,000 children that were sent to Terezin, only 100 survived. The other 14,900 were sent to extermination camps and murdered.
If we took a moment of silence for each victim of the Holocaust, we would be silent for 11 and a half years.
A lot of it took place in the evening when women could speak to each other after lights went out. They would talk about who they were, who they had been, in terms of the foods that they cooked. They would exchange recipes. They would talk about food, talk about their homes and the dinners they made. This was often called cooking with the mouth because you had nothing to eat.
Steiner Brown. But for 3 years in Theresienstadt or Terezin, I was only a number. The number's BF 621. Mina Pechter, the creator of the notebook that became the book, In Memory's Kitchen, was also only a number. AAR 312.
The handwritten scraps and jottings were collected by a woman named Mina Pachter and were finally published more than 50 years later. Survivor Bianca Steiner-Brown translated the recipes into English.
Sadly, I never met her. Mina Pechter was 71 years old. She died in Terezin of malnutrition in 1943. I was lucky. I survived. Bread you got every 2 or 3 days. And that bread had to last you. It was what we have here, let's say a rye bread, it was a quarter of a rye bread for 3 days. My bunk was a third one up, and I tried to go to sleep, and these women started discussing recipes. And I was hungry. These recipes had 4 eggs, and you have too much sugar, or whatever it was. And I was so mad at them because I needed the sleep, especially since I had very little food, nourishment in me.
The thought of women doing this was very shocking because you just think of people who were starving to death as sort of resigning from the fleshly pleasures. And instead, what I discovered is that, on the contrary, I think it helped them to live. I think, even though the food was imaginary, because I think food nourishes not just the body, but the spirit.
Well, we couldn't imagine that most of our families will be killed. So you lived in somehow, maybe in a dream world, let's say, that you couldn't, that you really felt, well, all right, it will be over in a while. And then we'll go home and I will cook or bake or whatever.
I mean, there's just no way of knowing exactly the circumstances. But the original manuscript, which is hand-sewn and filled with these fragile handwritings on this crumbly paper. About it's the world of these women as embodied in these recipes. There's a recipe in that book that I found for caramels from Baden. This woman would recite, you know, the ingredients, use this, use that, everything else. And then at the end, she said to wrap them in pink paper. And there was something about thinking about someone in a concentration camp carrying the fantasy of food that far or attempting to do it exactly right. That was such an incredible thought. The sense when one reads the recipes is not of shortcuts because they each knew each other's food, but rather of an inability to really write it down because they could no longer write it down. And so that you get reversed steps and you get things that aren't completed and you get sentences that just run off into space. And of course, one also has to speculate. Someone was called for a transport in the middle of writing a recipe. You just don't know.
Bianca is cooking recipes from the book to serve at an adult education program, where she will speak about her experience at Terezin.
Food is a powerful identity marker. It's one of the most powerful identity markers in the world, meaning the food of your childhood, what you grew up with, your celebrations, your memories of the meatloaf your mother made, these wonderful Svechkin cakes, and all of these other things. Those things are really imprinted on us in a very, very powerful way, whether we realize it or not. And I'm not saying these women realized what they were doing. I'm saying that one of the results of what they did is that they fought with Svechkin cake and Erdapfel Dalken and things like that. That in a funny way, it was fighting back when somebody's trying to erase you.
1, 2, 3.
I have come to feel that at some level it was being done for us. It was being done for the unseen others who might someday make these recipes again.
If food is a symbol of love, then a recipe passed on to an unknown future is a message of hope. And the desire to feed others, whether it can be realized or not, becomes a powerful affirmation of life.
There are more people who are indifferent than there are people who hate. Hate is an action. Hate takes time. Hate takes energy. Indifference is nothing. But indifference to hatred is encouraging hatred. What we must do is fight indifference. So what could I tell you is what I tell myself.
Jeffrey Geisner again, and I hope you found today's on-demand program, Terezin Diaries, Not Your Last Butterfly, informative and enlightening, as I did. See you again next time for another Jewish Culture and Holocaust. 10. 7. Remembrance and the One Revolution. Stand Against Hate. Presentation in our 2024 on-demand summer series. We will conclude today's program with time for reflection and prayer for our brothers and sisters in Israel. The brave IDF soldiers fighting for all of us. The innocents in Gaza and those in need of healing around the world.